Welcome to HBR Quarantine. I'm Adi Ignatius, the editor-in-chief of Harvard Business Review. My co-host is Josh Mocht, who heads product and innovation for us. As you know, we created HBR Quarantine a few months ago for our subscribers and followers who are working from home. We've been dealing with the issues related to COVID-19, their fallout on the world of business, on the world of work. More recently, we've also been talking about issues related to the Black Lives Matter movement and the question of how to combat racism in the workforce. If you watch this program, you know we often use a TikTok video to highlight it has been usually the lighter side of the current moment, but TikTok has also emerged as a citizen journalism tool for recording what's happening on the street. So here's a TikTok showing how protesters, I think about 10 days ago, peacefully took over the Golden Gate Bridge.
Here's how we turn a normal protest into a massive takeover that ended up on the news. As we marched, we noticed thousands of cars that passed us that show support for the Black Lives Matter movement. And they began to stop one by one to give us energy, and that allowed us a chance to jump on the freeway safely. What happened next was amazing. We started opening the floodgates, and next thing you know, we took over the whole bridge. Overall, it was successful. We gave the cops a run for their money, nobody got hurt, and we created enough attention to show the world that San Francisco also supports Black Lives Matter. Of course, the cops cornered a lot of us and broke it up as well.
So America, of course, is continuing to wrestle with the deep-rooted problems of bias and racism. This isn't the first time we've seen a national movement calling for institutional change in these areas, but this is one that seems to be touching corporate America more deeply than I at least can remember. The idea that Goodell, the NFL commissioner, is now urging teams to sign Colin Kaepernick, the quarterback who took a knee during the national anthem back in 2016-17 and has been too politically radioactive for the league to touch ever since, is actually an extraordinary development. It's easy to dismiss it as pandering or too late, but symbolically at least, there are things happening. NASCAR finally banning the Confederate flag from flying at its events is another basic example. But real sustained change is difficult and requires far more than CEO statements or gestures like this. For one thing, many people are pointing out a disconnect between these statements and the daily employee experience. As Garrett Hudson Banks and Richard Harvey wrote for Harvard Business Review recently in an article, is your company actually fighting racism or just talking about it? It requires hard work, a deep commitment, specific goals and actions, a willingness to embrace discomfort, and spending. That's true for corporate America. That's true at educational and nonprofit institutions like Harvard Business School, and yes, like Harvard Business Review. We're all trying to move from good intentions but poor results to a recognition that good intentions aren't enough. We need a radically different approach to move the needle on diversity and to learn how to become an anti-racist organization. In a moment, I'm going to bring in our guest today, who's Porter Braswell, co-founder and CEO of Jopwell, and an expert on how companies can create and sustain diverse workforces. But first, let me turn to my co-host, Josh Mock, for his thoughts.
Hey, how are you, Adi? It does make me think we are at this moment where so many of the people we're talking to and different executives are very frustrated. They are wanting they're activated now. We want to do some things and change and make real change. And I think what we're seeing is just like any big change initiative inside of a company, creating that anti-racist environment that you're talking about is going to take that investment, dedication, and the fact that we know, because in the pages of HBR, we've written for years that these change initiatives, unless they are done, very well and sustained with investment and thoughtfully, really strategically gone about, they, can fall like any change initiative. They can fall flat or lose steam, and nobody wants to see that right now. So, I know for us, we feel like we need to be really thinking about this as, both short term, what are we doing now, but that much longer term, sustained change that creates the environment we want. And I hope that that's what, a lot of the other executives that we're talking to really end up focusing on.
So I think we have a guest today who can help us address some of these questions. So let me make a full introduction for Porter Braswell. We're going to be talking to him in just a moment, and we also invite you, our viewers, to submit questions as well, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So Porter graduated in 2011 from Yale University, where, by the way, he played 4 years of varsity basketball. He went on to work for Goldman Sachs, and there he met Ryan Williams. And in 2014, the pair left Wall Street to create Jopwell, which is a career advancement platform for Black, Latinx, and Native American professionals. Porter also is author of the book, Let Them See You, the guide for leveraging your diversity at work. There's the book. So, Porter, I want to welcome you. These have been tumultuous weeks, at times inspiring, at times horrifying. How are you holding up?
I'm holding up. I'm holding in there. It's been, recently, personally, I have a newborn. And so 6 weeks ago, my wife and I had our first child and had a baby girl. And so it's been crazy to live through COVID, to have the birth of a new child, and to live in the country that we live in and the conversations that are happening. And so there's been a lot to process and deal with, and, what's going on externally versus what's going on within my household, and balancing it all is the story of every person in this country. And especially in the context of work, when you have so much happening in the household, but you have so much happening in society, and how can you bring your full self to work to be present, to be the most effective person you can be? And in my instance, and in many instances, while being a person of color. And so it's a lot to grapple with. So it's hard for me to say that I'm doing great. I'm hanging in there. I'm taking it day by day, and I'm appreciating being in the moment and being able to recognize that what we're living through this time feels different. And hopefully by the time my daughter is of my age, she'll be joining a workforce that these conversations become more authentic. They're more baked into the culture. And it doesn't just happen when there's a devastating death that occurs. It happens because it's a part of the fabric of an organization. So I'm doing all right.
That's good to hear. And you talk about kind of creating that fabric, and I'm wondering if we can probe that a little bit more, because probably for many people watching and listening, they might be looking at their diversity programs and thinking, we really haven't done too well. And so the question is, why haven't they made more progress, or what has been so difficult to get to kind of what you're talking about is, as a very different culture?
Yeah, I think there are many reasons why diversity initiatives at times either fall flat or they don't fully succeed. I would say the first thing is that it has to be a top-down approach. So leadership, executives, leaders within the firm, they have to have a strong perspective. They have to clearly and passionately be able to defend why diversity matters. They have to have a strong point of view. And oftentimes, a lot of leaders, while they know diversity intrinsically is important, they don't feel comfortable speaking about it. And so when you roll out a program and you push it off to a chief diversity officer to manage, or somebody else to manage, then it becomes not a top priority. And so oftentimes it's the CEO that needs to really develop the understanding and the confidence to speak about why these initiatives matter. And oftentimes that doesn't happen. So I would say that's one of the reasons why diversity initiatives fail. The second thing I would say is that oftentimes companies can't define what diversity means. And it's easy to say we're going to work on diversity initiatives, but what does that mean? Are we talking about ethnicity? Are we talking about sexual orientation? Are we talking about educational attainment? What does diversity mean in the context of your company? Where are you starting and where are you trying to go? And if you can't define that, then it's going to be really difficult to track success and to report on that. And so there's this unwillingness at times to be crystal clear on what you mean by diversity. But if you're serious about it, as you would be serious about solving any product challenge, you would define what the challenge is and you would have a product roadmap to address it. And oftentimes companies don't do that when they talk about diversity. And so, there's several reasons why these initiatives fail. But I think if I had to summarize it, it's a lack of leadership. It's a lack of feeling confident in speaking about it. And there's this lack of transparency that companies really don't want to engage in to show how much traction is being made. And so at the flip side of that, though, for those companies and those leaders that are head first in this dialogue, that are willing to be transparent, that can clearly define what diversity means and why are you defining it in that capacity, and show traction along the way, they tend to do these initiatives better.
So for leaders who, are moved by the moment and want to do more than just, do the performative allyship that we've seen a lot of, what's your advice? I mean, part of it seems to be that leaders have to be prepared to have uncomfortable conversations and put themselves in uncomfortable moments, and nobody likes to do that. So I guess what's your advice to set up these leaders to succeed if they're sincere about these efforts? What's your advice for how to handle these things most successfully?
Yeah, sometimes it's just being able to speak to your colleagues and really break down the walls where you have a timidness or you're somewhat afraid to engage in these conversations. And when you have potentially junior employees or mid-level employees that are identified as being a person of color, and there's a disconnect between, you don't have a real relationship, just given the size of most of these organizations. When a leader is willing to just listen and try to create empathy with an individual and just understand their perspective and their experiences in the context of their organization, I think understanding can occur. And far too often, I think a lot of the times leaders don't want to necessarily come off as being vulnerable to potentially junior employees, but it's through those conversations, and again, with a real willingness to listen and to learn from experiences and contexts and the backgrounds of folks within your organization, that's where understanding can start to happen. And it's through those dialogues, that listening tour, if you will, where you can understand the perspectives and then change can occur. At least there's context. And I think often there's this reluctance to, again, be vulnerable. But right now, with what's going on in this country, people are realizing that if you're not fighting against racism, then it's not enough. And that's like a hit to the system. So there is this moment where being vulnerable is okay. And so I think it's an opportunity to bring in others to the conversation to learn and then form a perspective so that you can lead by with authority.
Right. I think you're pointing to a moment too where so many of us are sort of reevaluating our own understanding of racism and thinking about anti-racism and how to build that kind of culture. I'm curious though, with so many, with the past where we haven't made the progress, what now, like what gives you optimism now that we're gonna, that there's real change or positive change in this moment?
Yeah. So it feels different this time. And I think for me, the reason why it feels different is because, white America is demanding change. And for this change that we want to see as a country, it can't just be Black America talking about it. White America has to engage in the dialogue and push for that change. And what's been optimistic for me is that it's not just happening externally and talking about all the reforms that need to happen in this country. It's also happening now in the context of corporations, where white employees are demanding more transparency, more diversity, more actions being taken. And now both parties are coming together with a single voice and a single message talking about the inequalities that have existed, again, in society and also within corporations. The voice is too loud to be ignored. Companies that don't engage in this dialogue and want to just wait on the sideline because they think that this moment's going to pass, they're not going to win. They're going to lose. They're going to lose, and their brand's going to take a hit. Their stock value is going to take a hit. Not being willing to engage in this dialogue and learn and progress, you're going to miss out on an amazing opportunity to build a tremendous culture of people who care about these topics. And ultimately, if your employee base feels like they can bring their authentic self to work, that's when people bring their, best ideas forward. And that's where innovation happens. So you have to engage in these dialogues if you want to meet employees where they are.
What would let's flip it a little bit. What would your advice be then for individuals who might find themselves, in a company, on a team as the sole, the only person of color, in a company, on a team? What's your advice for how to handle that?
Yeah. So that, I've been that person. I've been the only in a room far too many times. And in that moment, it could feel isolating. It can feel intimidating. You can feel like your voice doesn't matter. And that is called having the spotlight on you. And when you have the spotlight on you, two things can happen. You can shrink and be afraid of it, or you can step into that light. And by stepping in that light, I mean that you have a unique advantage in that moment when you're the only, because you're the person that has a different background, you have a different experience, you have different context. So when everybody else in the room is thinking about challenges and about a problem at hand, likely in a similar way, you can bring a different experience and you can leverage your diversity as an asset. And so what I encourage folks, when you find yourself to be the only, leverage that as a unique ability because you have a perspective that others likely don't have. And so it's your advantage. So long gone are the days where being the diverse person or being the only person in the room, you are, sit in the side and be happy that you're in the room. That's not a thing anymore. You have a seat at the table. It's your responsibility to speak up, to share your perspective, and you can leverage your diversity again as an asset. And now is an opportunity for professionals of color to really help corporate America understand the context and perspectives of what's going on, again, externally, because that's now coming internally.
Are you seeing where there are companies now that, are good examples, or could you share some of those with us?
So, we fortunately see it across the board. There are many companies that are doing a great job when it comes to really engaging in this dialogue. Some of our partners, UBS is a great example. They, the reason why I would point to them as being a great example is that they committed to working with us for 5 years. And so they knew that diversity it's not just a moment in time initiative. It's not just we're going to focus on it for this year. They know that the context and the history of where they've come from and where they're trying to go, it's going to take time. So making a real investment to bring somebody in to help further, what they want to do from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, and making that a long-term commitment is a really impressive thing. Also, throughout the course of the years, as we think about, again, having this diversity roadmap to track success, it allows to show that milestones are being reached. And that's also an example of a relationship with Tom Naradol. He is their, head of North America, and he's involved in the relationship. And so top-down, long-term commitment, thinking about diversity in a holistic way, from events to hiring to retention. Those are the types of partnerships that we get excited about. And those are the types of companies that ultimately will win.
So if you just joined us, this is HPR Quarantine. Our guest today is Porter Braswell. We're talking about how to do better to achieve a diverse workforce. And I urge you, we're getting some good questions. I want to get to them in a second, and I urge people to submit more. Let me ask, Harvard Business Review, like other companies, we talk about the pipeline challenge in our diversity efforts. We want to hire talent from underrepresented groups, but tell ourselves we just aren't finding them in the pipeline or in our application pools. What do you say to that?
So that's why we built Jopwell. Companies if you go back to the spring of 2014, a lot of tech companies were coming out with their lack of diversity stats. And it was the first time that companies were so transparent about their lack of diversity, despite we all knew that there was a lack of diversity in tech. But it was the first time it became a national conversation. And the reason a lot of companies were claiming that they had a lack of diversity is because they claimed that there was a lack of a pipeline. Now, I'm joining you all from New York City, and there were some New York City companies that said the same thing. So this notion that the talent doesn't exist is BS. And that's why we built Jopwell, so that companies can no longer say that they can't find Black, Latinx, and Native American students and professionals. So with Jopwell, really leading the charge on this, we have a community of hundreds of thousands of individuals. So companies can no longer say that they can't find the talent. The talent is there. The question is, how do you authentically engage and market to this audience such that they want to apply and be a part of the pipeline for you to consider? And so the challenge now that companies have to deal with is, how do you get your messaging and your brand out in a very authentic way to this audience that historically may not have recognized that they were qualified to work at your company? You know, in the case of Harvard Business Review, what are you looking for in terms of talent? You know, if I'm a potential job seeker, and if I go back to when I was graduating from college, you know, I don't know. I would have thought, if I'm not a writer, I can't work at Harvard Business Review. But of course, that's not the case. So how are you getting your messaging out that, you know, there's plenty of roles and opportunities for, maybe if we're not known for those things, there's still opportunities for you. And how do you get that in front of the audience? And really, that's the vehicle of Jopwell. That's why we exist, to do that type of work.
Josh, you know, I'm gonna go to some questions from the audience, and here, this is one from Bruno in Peru, who asks, you know, should racial diversity take priority to some extent over academic background or work experience when companies are trying to hire a more diverse workforce?
So there's a couple of things here. So one, I believe that companies should hire the best person for the job, regardless of any type of background. The reality of it is that a company, historically, they don't have diverse applicants coming through their funnel. So by default, if you're not considering what this country looks like, you're not going to hire the best people. You're only looking at a certain funnel of candidates, so you're missing out on a lot of talent. Number two, the mere fact that somebody is a person of color, they have perceived this country in a different way. They have lived through experiences that now bring a unique perspective to that workforce. So by the mere fact of being a person of color, I can join an organization that likely isn't reflective of what the population looks like for folks of color in this country, and I can offer that unique perspective. So it's a business imperative to hire diverse individuals. And it's been proven time and time again that having a more ethnically diverse workforce leads to bottom line success. McKinsey has done plenty of reports on this, and so they're publicly available. And so the notion that companies shouldn't focus directly on recruiting people of color is been disproven. Having a more ethnically diverse workforce leads to bottom line success. We bring unique perspectives. So from a diversity lens, yes, there should be a focus on recruiting from ethnically underrepresented groups.
So here's another question. This is from Comfort from Los Angeles. So a lot of companies now have a chief diversity officer or that role, if not necessarily that title. The question is the ethnicity of the chief diversity officer important? In other words, can a person who has never experienced racial injustice be the one in charge of programs that are meant to address those issues?
So I don't think that a color of an individual will define if they're going to be a good or a bad chief diversity officer. I think that the bigger question is around what resources does a chief diversity officer have at their fingertips? Are they the single person in an organization that's tasked with driving a more diverse culture? Because I don't care if they're white, black, or whatever, they're not going to find success. So oftentimes a chief diversity officer will fail in their job because they're tasked with taking on this, changing the culture. And if you're going to do that, then you better make sure that that individual has resources and human capital alongside of them to drive that change. And so I think a person of color more naturally can have empathy for what diverse audiences experience, but that's not to say that somebody from a majority culture can't be successful in that. They have to have others on their team that come from an underrepresented group so they can have that perspective. And so I think it comes down to the resources that are available for a chief diversity officer to actually find success.
Porter, I'm wondering, so a lot of the companies you work with are recruiting all over the world, for sure. But at the same time, there feels like there's a very local, in your community element to all of this. I mean, I think about it for our own company, for sure. I think it's easy sometimes for companies not to be playing a role in their communities or positioned in their communities as, you know, places where people can look to and work with them. How important is that, especially for these larger companies, that they also have this local element?
It's incredibly important. I mean, again, my context is calling in here from New York City. So if you're a New York company, and you don't reflect what New York City looks like, it's hard to make a statement about why you have a lack of diversity. I mean, at Jopwell, we practice what we preach. The majority of the people that work at Jopwell are people of color. The largest population are women. And so to say that tech companies can't be, majority women or majority folks of color, it's not true. We've built a very successful tech company with these demographics. And so, it's being able to tap into the local talent and relying on your employees to also be stewards of your company to bring in more diverse talent is incredibly important. And you miss out on so much talent if you're not looking locally.
So Jopwell did something interesting a few years ago in creating stock photography that looked more like the diverse workforces we're trying to achieve, and I guess less like stock photography typically looked. And we're showing some of those images now. Can you talk about what was the problem you were trying to solve with that?
Yeah, well, there's a lack of representation in corporate America, and again, going back to the conversation we were having about being the only in a room, it can feel isolating. It can make you go to places of insecurity. And the imagery that companies were using, as a person of color looking for an opportunity, I wouldn't want to engage because I wouldn't see myself reflected in that company. So we thought, well, why don't we just change the imagery that companies are leveraging and give it out for free? So it's completely for free. And we decided to take imagery of people in our community so that when they are applying for opportunities at the companies we work with, at least they can see themselves reflected. And for us, that representation matters. And so we thought it was something that we can do to provide value for the brands that we work with. We thought we could do it for our community so that they know that they're represented. And I'm glad we did it. And so far it's been incredibly successful and one that it shouldn't have taken so long to see representation within these images.
I'm going to go to a couple more questions from the audience. Again, if you just joined us, HPR Quarantine, our guest is Porter Braswell, the CEO of Jopwell, and we're talking about diversity in the workforce. So here are a couple questions that are linked. This is first from Irvin from Salt Lake City, who asked, how does a company measure whether their diversity efforts are working? And a related question from Lawrence from Ghana. Do you think it's time corporations started reporting diversity activities or investments in their annual report? So it's really, our audience probably tends to believe, you make progress when you measure things. So the questions are, how do we measure progress in this area?
Yeah, so I think that the most important thing when it comes to measuring and tracking success is to have an understanding of where you are on your diversity journey. So if you are a company that's been around for decades, or you have an entire team, you have a diversity team that's dedicated to it, you're going to be on a very different part of the journey than if you are, a well-capitalized startup that launched 2 years ago or even a year ago. And so being able to clearly articulate where you stand on your diversity journey and what the next milestone looks like is going to be a very unique thing for each company. So on the early side of the equation, maybe you're not getting diverse individuals even applying, or maybe diverse individuals aren't even familiar with your brand. So how do you think more about employer branding efforts to drive a more diversified applicant funnel? And maybe that's the state of your current diversity journey. Now, maybe you're a bit ahead of that. Maybe you have historically been getting plenty of diverse applicants, but you're not converting them. So you're looking at the bottom of the funnel. And what are you going to show in terms of traction? How have the numbers changed from the conversion to being, applying to actually getting the job? More diverse companies that have been around, for a bit longer and they have more diversity initiatives in place, you can look at the retention. How have we been able to change the retention dynamics of the diverse individuals within our organization? So it really depends on the state of your diversity journey, how long you've been engaging in this dialogue for you to clearly define what success looks like.
For sure. The other question I have for you is around, you said that you yourself are a product of diversity initiatives with, in the summertime, when you were younger, ending up at Morgan Stanley and then eventually at Yale. And I'm curious what you think about those looking back now. What do you think about those initiatives?
So, again, I was very fortunate that somebody tapped me on the shoulder when I was in high school and said to me, Morgan Stanley is offering a entry-level early access pipeline for high school students who are diverse. You should apply. And I didn't know what Morgan Stanley was or what finance meant, but I knew it was a job that was going to pay. And so I got lucky. I applied and I got the internship. And once I found my footing within the context of Morgan Stanley, my freshman year at Yale, I applied for an internship at Goldman Sachs, also through like a diversity recruiting initiative. Again, got the opportunity, and I worked there 3 summers in college. And so for me, the early access pipeline and being exposed to professional opportunities from a really early age was incredibly powerful for me. It taught me from an early age that working in finance was a way and a vehicle to make money so that I can go back and help out communities I'm passionate about. And I got exposed to that. So I think it's really important to expose, especially from underrepresented communities, what being a professional at a context of a corporation looks like as early as possible. If you're going to recruit them out of college and you have access to high school pipelines, you might as well start getting in front of them then. You build brand loyalty, if nothing else. And so I think it's really important to get those early pipelines, to identify those underrepresented groups, start engaging, start marketing to them in a very authentic way, provide them access to professional opportunities so that you increase the pipeline, and then the communities start to talk about those opportunities to their friends. And again, the brand recognition and the investment within the community grows. And it's a very inexpensive way to help with your employer branding, getting out in front of a diverse audience while also providing economic opportunities for underserved communities.
Now, I know we're gonna run out of time quick. Or do you have another question from the audience? Adi?
Yeah, I got a couple, and we can keep this going for a while. So a couple questions about recruiters. This is from Coombe in San Francisco. Would you say that even recruiters themselves play a role in whether or not we're diverse? In other words, could the bias of recruiters be leading to or reinforcing the bias in companies and in hiring? And similar question from Crystal in Houston: how can recruitment evolve to cast a wider net and acquire more diverse talent?
Yeah, great question. And we're actually a colleague of mine is working on a piece on this right now. The front lines should be reflective of the types of candidates you're trying to recruit. Candidates should feel reflected in the people that they're interviewing with. So as I think about diversifying recruiters as the gatekeepers, that's critical. And oftentimes companies completely don't think about that. And so as a candidate trying to find my way within this organization, if I can see myself reflected in the person that's recruiting me, that's a very powerful first interaction. And so I think having a diverse recruiting staff is critical. And it's incumbent on the recruiters to, again, have that strong point of view and perspective about why diversity matters within the context of that organization, how that company is thinking about diversity, and explaining the why behind it all. And it shouldn't be relegated to just, professionals of color who are the recruiters. The majority culture should feel comfortable and confident engaging in these dialogues as well. That's why it's so important that diversity is ingrained in the fabric of a company's culture. So it's not just relegated to professionals of color. It's everybody's job to be able to speak passionately and with authority about why diversity matters, how are we defining diversity, and what initiatives do we have in place to ensure that we will continue to have a diverse organization.
So related to that was my question before, was kind of related to this, is that, there is this moment, as we were talking about earlier, where there's this, the public has this deep sense of injustice and frustration, and there's emotion, and we want to move on that. It feels like we really need to keep those conversations going inside the company with programming, with, bringing the right editorial, the right voices. Are you seeing that as discrete roles in company for people to kind of come in and fill those roles as driving that conversation on a full-time basis?
So it's incredibly important to have people focus on it 100% of the time. But again, it can't be one person in the sea of thousands whose job it is to be that voice. It has to be a collective voice of the organization. Now, there can be people tasked with developing the strategy around bringing the entire organization together to have these dialogues. But if a company just thinks they're going to hire one person and then all of a sudden they're going to be fine, they are they're going to set themselves up for failure. There have to be resources dedicated towards it. And you have to be willing to solve this problem and invest as much resources in solving this problem as you would be any other product problem or marketing initiative. You have to devote the resources and recognize that it has to be ingrained in the culture, and it's everybody's job. It's not just one person's job.
So here's a question from Guy in New York. It's really about quotas. Is there a place for quotas? Should diversity be about a measurable quota that a company is required to meet, or rather more a value that needs to be integrated into a company's culture?
So no. So again, it goes back to a belief. It goes back to the belief that diversity is a business imperative. If diversity is a business imperative, it has to be a part of the conversation. Recruiters have to understand why diversity matters and the candidates that you're bringing in. If you have to be transparent about the progress that you're making. If you go out and have a quota that says, we're going to hire X amount of Black people this year, and I'm a Black person that gets hired into your organization, how am I supposed to feel about that? It can come off as being very inauthentic. So in a very authentic way, it needs to just be a part of the culture and the fabric of the company, where these conversations don't just happen because there's a tragedy that happens in this country. You are missing the point. If a company was all of a sudden going to come out and say, well, we're going to hire 100 Black people this year. Again, this has to be something where a company understands the state of their diversity journey, the context and how they got to where they are, and what are they going to do, and what are they going to measure to prove that they're making progress on this, with the understanding that diversity matters because it leads to bottom line success. We need innovation. We need creativity. By 2040, again, the majority of people in this country are going to be people of color. So we have to understand this changing consumer habit. It's not just we have to hire 10 Black people. You're going to miss. You're going to lose. So again, it has to be in the context of understanding where you stand and how do you show measurable and tangible results, and bringing more diverse perspectives into the context of that company. I think that's the most important thing.
It also feels like, Porter, when you talk, I really like the way you're pointing towards how do you create the most engaged workforce, and that where people really bring their true self. And we talk a lot about that within the pages of HBR. I'm curious, when you look at your own company, how do you either measure that or feel that piece of, that people are as engaged as you want them to be?
Yeah, it changes. It's what engagement looked like from Jopwell employees, let's call it 2 months ago, pre-COVID, is very different than what it looked like let's call it before the last 3 weeks. So working in an all virtual capacity, what does engagement look like? And then now, over the last, call it few weeks of what's going on in this country, engagement has shifted at Jopwell. What does it look like to be engaged as an employee at Jopwell? So engagement is one of these things that has ebbs and flows to it. And I think it's incumbent upon the company to really figure out the moment that we're living in, what's going on externally, how do you allow people to bring their authentic selves to work every day, because that's how you're going to get the most engagement. So if something is happening in this society that disproportionately affects certain communities, and you have those communities represented within your company, but you're not willing to engage in those conversations, you're not going to get engagement. And not only you're not going to get engagement from that community, again, the majority culture now is starting to listen to some of what's going on, and they're going to be louder and saying, how come we're not engaging in these dialogues? And these voices get loud, and then companies are forced to react, and then they're reactionary, and then they come out with something that's completely tone deaf, and it's not authentic, and they hurt their brands. So it's one of these things companies have to start to get really proactive, really have a strategy in place so that they're leading with authority and with a strong point of view.
So I'm going to ask one more question, Josh, and then you can take us out. But this is, I hope a lot of our viewers are feeling inspired, feeling moved to do something, try to take a first step, a first meaningful step. So, Porter, I don't mean to put you overly on the spot here, but what would your advice be for people who are ready? Okay, I'm ready to do something. What's your advice to take that first meaningful step against racism, bias in the workplace? What's your advice?
I would say seek out help. Reach out to those that are knowledgeable about this space, that have context and history and and a background in this type of work, and ask for help. Reach out to your colleagues, reach out to your friends. Jopwell, we're here. We're supportive of the companies we work with, but reach out and ask for help. Again, and remember that this is not just a moment in time. To me, the tragedy of this moment could be that if, white America is ready to go, but next quarter, we don't have that same fever of being an ally. If this was just a moment in time, then it was for naught. And so I hope that this is the calling and the wake-up call that we are all going to live with for the rest of our lives. And I think that that's where we're going to see change. But if it's a fleeting moment and people aren't willing to ask for help, then I'm fearful that this is just another, moment in time that people have talked about diversity, but we don't see real change. But if this is something that people are willing to ask for help, they're willing to acknowledge their blind spots, and they're willing to devote the resources, then this time can be different.
Thanks so much. I think we're out of time now. And I just want to say thank you very much for coming on the show, Porter. It was great to have you here and get the benefit of your expertise and your passion and learn more. For so many of us, it's a huge benefit. And so thank you very much. You're welcome. And thank you, Audie. And I want to also thank everyone for tuning in this week. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
So here we are with our special behind-the-scenes footage. It's free, as is everything related to HBR quarantine. But anyway, I thought Porter Braswell was fantastic. I really thought.
Yeah, really.
I don't know if I would have been that articulate with a newborn at home. So additional props to Porter for.
Yeah, definitely.
I would be so sleep deprived at that point that I probably couldn't speak. So, but. Yeah.
Do you think Porter wants to join us? I think he's still on.
Oh, good.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, Porter, do you mind joining us after the show?
Yeah, for sure.
This is our behind-the-scenes post-mortem.
We stick around for a little bit afterward.
So, Porter, you got to admit, I asked better questions than Josh, right?
Very engaging questions from both of you.
That's very political.
I think just what you're talking about is so complex because you get at the whole issue of kind of creating a very different culture and environment, which we're like yearning for. And I feel like, a lot of us are out running to do things. But we really want to make this a sustainable thing. And I do think the ongoing education piece within our company is just so critical. But as a piece, and I like the way you say, you're not going to hire one person for sure. It's going to be a group effort.
Well, what I'm fearful of is companies will hire the person to focus on diversity. Mm-hmm. And they're going to say a year from now that person failed because that person single-handedly did not make the organization more diverse. Right. Employee sentiment surveys are going to remain the same. Yeah. And they're going to look to the person and say, well, we invested in the person and nothing happened. And it's like, it's so stupid and so ignorant to think that all of a sudden something's going to change by bringing one person in.
And the other thing you say that, because I said this at the outset, but when we publish a lot by John Carter on change management. And the big thing is change management fails usually. Like all these initiatives, it's not this, it's everything. Because people don't go at the sort of systematic, like, how are we going to dedicate ourselves to transforming the company? And I really, we've got to be methodical about, like, this is a wholesale big, and it's not just internal, it's external too.
Yeah.
So some of the questions I wasn't able to get to sort of talked about initiatives, well-meaning initiatives within companies that may be really having a detrimental impact on the diversity question, employee referral programs, the sort of internship programs that tend to favor friends and family. I mean, they're all whatever. They're fine, but they're not fine. Well, let me know. I'd be interested in what you think. I mean, I can't imagine that they're helping create more diverse workforces.
Well, here's the thing. So the frustrating thing to me is that I'm not against the theme behind quotas. What I'm against is that you call it a quota. So when it's bringing folks of color into an organization, it has to be a quota. But when people refer their friends and they skip the interview process, or when people can have a letter of recommendation written from XYZ person and they get to skip the committee, is that a quota? So, or you're an athlete and you get recruited into a college, like that's not a quota. So it's just like this notion of, in corporate America, when you have to hire more people of color, you want to call it a quota. So you are putting this label on somebody who deserves to be there, and it gives a justification for everybody else to be like, oh, they got there because that's part of a quota.
Yep.
But you got there because your friend is so-and-so at the country club. So, what are you labeled as?
Yeah.
And so give folks of color a label, it drives this further division within the context of a company. And so that's the frustration part. Like, of course, companies should be hiring more people of color. That's what we do. But why do you have to then label it something to justify why you hired that person?
Yeah, it must be. You work all over the world too, so it's got to be interesting culturally to see the differences to these big issues around the world. It must just vary so much.
Well, we focus the work on what we do within the U.S. So in the U.S., we focus on Black, Latinx, and Native Americans. When it comes to working with companies on a more global scale, it really is around the advisory work, because the talent base that we have is U.S.-centric. Mm-hmm. But we understand the companies in a multinational type way, they have to understand and engage with local communities. And so that's more of the advisory things that we offer.
Yeah, that's cool.
All right, well, listen, Porter, we should probably let you get back to your child or your day job or the various demands on your time.
Congratulations, by the way.
Yeah, we did see a lot of comments coming in to say congrats on your new arrival. So
I appreciate it.
And I hope you're getting enough sleep.
Yeah.
All right, well, this is real goodbye.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Thanks, Adi. Thanks, Porter. Thanks, Dave. See you later.